The Republican National Convention is an event held every election cycle, where a group of Republican delegates decide who to nominate for the presidential election. In August of 1984, the convention met in Dallas, Texas, where then-President Ronald Reagan was named for re-election. During his time in office, the Reagan administration implemented a policy supporting anti-communist insurgents as a way of fighting against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. This policy was known as the Reagan Doctrine, and it was a policy which threatened the existence of communist organizations throughout the United States, such as the Revolutionary Communist Youth Brigade. A subsect of the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Revolutionary Communist Youth Brigade was a student-led organization which discussed far-left politics and occasionally held protests. One of these protests was a demonstration dubbed the Republican War Chess Tour, and it was a demonstration against the Reagan Doctrine as well as the idea that Reagan would continue the Cold War. Demonstrators marched through Dallas, Texas, committing petty acts of disruption and vandalism as they spray-painted walls, knocked over potted plants, and pretended to be dead, to simulate the effects of a nuclear war. At one point, an unnamed protester removed an American flag from the Mercantile Bank building and gave it to a man named Gregory Lee Johnson, who hid it under his shirt for the majority of the march, all the way to the Dallas City Hall where the aforementioned Republican National Convention was taking place. Once there, Johnson took the flag out from under his shirt, laid it on the ground, poured kerosene on it, and the group watched as it went up in flames. As the flag burned, protesters shouted various catchy chants such as,
"Ronald Reagan, killer of the hour, perfect example of U.S. power. Reagan, Mondale, which will it be? Either one means World War III.
And,
Red, white, and blue, we spit on you. You stand for plunder, you will go under."
Despite all of this burning and spitting and chanting, nobody was injured during the protest, and as the flag burned on, demonstrators were presumably pretty proud of themselves. Unfortunately, this moment didn't last too long, as less than an hour after the flag burned, police showed up and hauled Johnson off to jail for arson, for breach of peace, and for vandalism. He was then tried and convicted of all three of these charges, and spent his next few years in a cell, contemplating his actions and really wishing he hadn't burned that flag. Except I just lied. Johnson was hauled off to jail, and he was tried and convicted, and he was even fined $2,000, and he was told he had to spend a year in jail. But it wasn't for arson, or for breach of peace, or for vandalism. Johnson was instead tried and convicted for violating a Texas state law prohibiting the desecration of a state or American flag. And whoever came up with that statute is probably a little annoyed that Johnson got charged with it. One thing you might know about college-age political extremists is that they do not stop talking. They will talk, and they will talk, and they will keep talking until they feel as though they have adequately convinced you to join their side. So, when Johnson was convicted for this violation, he appealed to the Texas 5th District Court of Appeals. The Texas 5th District Court of Appeals did not agree with Johnson, and he was once again found guilty of violating the state law. So Johnson took his case instead to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. And unlike the other two courts, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals actually did overturn his conviction, as they agreed that Johnson's First Amendment right to free speech had been violated. If flag burning was protected under freedom of speech for Johnson, though, then it should also be protected under freedom of speech for everyone else. So the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals filed a writ of certiorari to the Supreme Court, asking them to decide whether flag burning is constitutional. In 1988, the Supreme Court agreed to review the case, and on March 21, 1989, the Supreme Court gathered to decide whether flag burning counts as symbolic speech. Kathy Alice Drew, an assistant district attorney for Dallas, Texas, argued on behalf of the plaintiff, the state of Texas. Drew argued that the American flag acts as a symbol of unity and that the government should subsequently see it necessary to protect it from desecration. She felt as though allowing its desecration could lessen its symbolic impact. She had also planned on discussing how Johnson's actions constituted a breach of peace, but by the time she would have gotten to that point, almost all of her time had been spent, so she decided to save her remaining time to give her rebuttal. As for the defendant, Gregory Lee Johnson, David Cole wrote, and William Kunstner argued, on his behalf. They felt as though flag burning should be protected under the First Amendment, as though the burning was not a verbal but rather a physical offense, it was still a symbolic representation, and thus it constituted as symbolic speech. They also drew comparisons between the flag as a symbol of our nation and the cross as a symbol of religion, as, though the burning of the cross may offend some, it is still protected, so too should be the burning of the American flag. On June 21, 1989, the Supreme Court voted 5-4 for Johnson, and it was decided that flag burning is protected by the First Amendment under symbolic speech. The majority opinion was delivered by Justice William Brennan, who cited three other cases. First, he cited Stromberg versus California. In 1931, after displaying a red flag symbolizing his socialist ideals at a youth camp, Yetta Stromberg was charged for violating a California state law prohibiting displaying a flag in a public place as a sign, symbol, or emblem of opposition to organized government, as an indication or stimulus to anarchistic action, or as an aid to propaganda that is of a seditious nature. Stromberg's conviction was overturned, though, and this was the case which decided that non-speech acts should still be protected under the First Amendment, and named these acts symbolic speech. The second case Justice Brennan cited was Tinker versus Des Moines. In 1969, a group of students made a plan to wear black armbands to school as a way to wordlessly voice their support for a truce in the Vietnam War. When the principals in the district learned of their plan, they created a policy banning black armbands, and when Christopher Eckhart, Mary Beth Tinker, and John Tinker wore their bands to school, they were sent home. They sued the district, and the case moved all the way to the Supreme Court, who decided that wearing a black armband should be protected, again, as symbolic speech. These two cases gave examples of what falls under symbolic speech, and Justice Brennan used them to argue that, if displaying a flag or wearing an armband count, then burning a flag should too. His argument was probably more persuasive than my retelling, but he still faced opposition, and two dissenting opinions were written, one by Justice William Rehnquist and the other by Justice John Paul Stevens. Justice Rehnquist argued that the American flag is not just a political symbol, but a symbol of unity within our nation. According to Justice Rehnquist, the flag is revered by almost all Americans, no matter their personal belief systems, and that this justifies the laws held by 48 of 50 states criminalizing flag burning. Justice Stevens argued a similar point, but his conclusion differed from Justice Rehnquist, as he additionally argued that the issue at hand was not an issue of ideology, but of conduct. He claimed that Johnson's conduct was inarticulate and offensive, as he felt there was no need to destroy what he called a symbol of freedom, of opportunity, of religious tolerance, and of goodwill for other people. This is why Justice Brennan cited the third case, Brandenburg versus Ohio. In 1969, a Ku Klux Klan leader named Brandenburg was convicted under an Ohio criminal syndicalism law prohibiting public speech advocating for criminal activity. Brandenburg appealed his conviction, believing what he said should be protected under the First Amendment. And though a few members of the court were probably a little upset that they had to agree with the KKK leader, he still won the case, and it became precedent that the state may only punish speech which incites imminent and lawless action. Justice Brennan argued that Johnson's actions could not incite imminent lawless action, as said action was already occurring around him during the protest, and that Brandenburg's case highlighted the importance of not allowing biases, even towards the American symbol, to restrict freedom of speech. In a concurring opinion, much like the justices on Brandenburg's case, Justice Anthony Kennedy expressed that though he disagreed on a personal moral level with Johnson, flag burning still should be protected under the First Amendment, which I personally think is pretty based. The Supreme Court's 5-4 vote had a wider impact than simply exonerating Johnson. A 5-4 vote for Johnson meant that the Texas state law against flag burning was no longer constitutional, which meant that the 48 other states with laws against flag burning were also no longer constitutional. For a brief period of time, in 1990, Congress decided that it should actually be a federal crime to desecrate the flag, and they passed the Flag Protection Act. But that same year, in the Supreme Court case United States v. Eichmann, the Flag Protection Act was struck down as the act was seen more as a method of suppression of expression than as a legitimate act. And nowadays, before you watch this video, you may have thought that flag burning was still illegal, but I can assure you that it isn't. You, as a United States citizen, can burn anything, and it might be protected under freedom of speech. And I think that's beautiful.